Great. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come speak here. I'm really excited. If you could do me a favor, if you could let me know maybe when there are 5 minutes left.
Absolutely.
And that way I'll know that I have only like a half an hour left at that point. So I'm going to be talking about securing wallets. The title is meant to be to make you curious. When I talk about a federated key management network, I'm going to describe exactly what I mean by that, and describe how I kind of think of it as one of two alternate models for threshold cryptography. So at a very high level, right, we've already heard a number of talks this morning about threshold cryptography and threshold signatures in particular. And the high level idea, right, is that you have a key, but rather than maintaining the key at one single location, which would be a single point of compromise, the key is instead shared into different pieces so that none of the pieces by themselves actually is sufficient to generate a signature. But if the parties holding those pieces can all work together and run some interactive protocol, then they can generate a signature on any desired message, or more generally, right, they can perform any cryptographic task, like we saw this morning in the case of threshold decryption for Payet encryption. And just to kind of establish some terminology, I don't think this maybe was explicit in any of the talks this morning, but I'm going to use T to refer to a bound on the number of corrupted parties. So often we'll talk about protocols that are T plus 1 out of n. And I know it's actually a big debate, actually, whether T should be the number of corrupted parties or the number of parties required to sign. And I'm not sure that the community has settled on the right notion, and different communities have different conventions. But in this talk, I'll let T refer to a bound on the number of corrupted parties. And what this means, essentially, is that we have shares of the cryptographic key that are going to be stored by n parties. And T plus 1 of those parties need to come together and run some interactive protocol in order to perform the desired cryptographic operation. And generally in this context, we'll have security, as I said, up to corruptions of T of the parties. I'll only be considering the case when those T corrupted parties can behave maliciously. That's the case of interest in practice. And I'll stress also that even though I won't, for a lot of the talk, I won't be talking about key generation, but I will always be assuming that the key is generated using a distributed protocol itself, so that the key is never actually resident in one place at any point in time. So throughout the lifetime of the key, there's never a single point of failure. And I want to just point out, this will come into play at one point during my talk, that you can actually have protocols where there's no sharp divide between the number of corrupted parties that can be tolerated and the number of parties needed to generate a signature. So in particular, when I talk about honest majority protocols later on in the talk, there we'll have protocols that can tolerate T corrupted parties, but you'll actually require, or it can be the case that you require 2 T plus 1 parties to get together in order to generate a signature. Great. So now I want to talk about the two different models that I see for threshold signatures. And actually, I should point out that a lot of what I'm saying here is informed by my experience working for defense in the context of using threshold signatures to protect cryptocurrency wallets. But what I'm saying, I think, is actually more general than that. I think it can apply to the use of threshold signatures in many other contexts, and even to threshold cryptography beyond signatures. But I'm going to sort of focus, at least in my mind, on the context of threshold signatures for cryptocurrency wallets. And so one sort of model for threshold signatures is that we take these key shares that I talked about earlier, and we'll distribute them so that 2 of the key shares are being stored on some server. You can think of these as servers in the cloud, servers that are managed by some company. And then the remaining key share is going to be stored by the user, the quote-unquote owner of the wallet, on a personal device such as their cell phone. And then when the user wants to generate a signature, they'll run some interactive protocol. The arrows kind of indicate the logical flow here of executing the protocol, even if from the user's point of view, they may be interacting with a single sort of entry point. And then on the back end, you may have some protocol being run among some number of servers. But at least conceptually, you have a protocol being run among these various parties, resulting in the generation of a signature. And a different model is where you take the key shares, and of course, they don't have to be only 3. This is just for illustrative purposes. And you have all of those key shares resident on servers being operated by some company or companies. And then the user is going to interact with those back-end servers every time it wants to generate a signature. And so the way this might work then is you have the user from their cell phone, for example, issue a request to those servers to generate some signature. And again, this could be done via a single access point. So from the user's point of view, they're just making a single API query. And then on the back end, there's some message processing, sending that request to the different servers. And then the servers on their own are going to run some interactive protocol that's going to result in the generation of a signature on behalf of the user. Okay? And I'll flesh out this model in a little bit more detail as the talk goes along. By the way, I don't know if it's possible, but I'm happy to encourage questions during the talk if it's feasible. I know that it's hard to hear a little bit and people have to walk with a microphone, but if there are questions during the talk, I'm happy to take them. That might be easier than saving them to the end, but I know it might be hard for people to do that.
No, we can have a runner on each side. If anybody wants to ask active questions, you can hand you a mic. Happy to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah. You want John on the side?
Now, one question that comes up when, and let me just actually say here that this picture on the right-hand side is what I'm referring to in the title as a federated key management network. Okay, so the three servers that are storing the key shares form a network, and they're managing a key, as it were, on behalf of this user device. Now, one question that immediately comes to mind when people see a picture like this is the question of custody, right? Who actually maintains custody of the key? And I want to point out here that there are really two questions that are related but not identical. There's first of all a legal question about custody, and I'm not going to really give an opinion about that. I mean, I can give my opinion, but I'm not a lawyer, and so I don't really have the final say on what legally constitutes custody or not. There's also the philosophical question about custody in terms of who has control over the ability to issue a signature. And some people, philosophically, don't like the idea that one company holds all the private key shares. But what I want to point out is a couple of reasons why it's actually not really that bad, and I think really makes a lot of sense. And actually, one of the themes of the talk is going to be why I think this model makes a lot of sense. But let me just address this question of custody up front. So first of all, what I want to point out is that there are a lot of different ways to mitigate this potential issue. So one way to mitigate it is you can actually have these servers that I had on the previous slide. You can have them actually generating and storing the key shares in hardware enclaves. Right? The question came up this morning about combining trusted execution environments with MPC, and I think this is one example. So what I mean here is that you can have the secret key shares being resident in the hardware enclave on those servers, meaning actually two things. First of all, meaning that even the company which is managing a server holding a key share does not have direct access to the key, and to the key share rather. And moreover, you can even use the TEE to attest to the fact that the server is running an MPC protocol, some specified MPC protocol. Right? And this sort of removes the concern that the company that operates the server itself could read the contents of what's on the machine and thereby sign something on behalf of the user. So if you use enclaves, that problem goes away to a large extent. You can also federate this network across different partner companies and organizations. So, I mean, I didn't specify one way or the other on the previous slide, but the servers that were drawn there, the three servers, need not be operated by a single company. Right? You can move from a model where rather than imagining these three servers being operated by a single entity, you instead have them each operated by a different entity, by a different company. And they have partner agreements that allow them to do this and to run a protocol, a signing protocol on behalf of the user. But no single company would actually have the ability to access the threshold number of shares and thereby generate a signature for the user. And finally, just in terms of this custody question, one thing that we believe from our point of view is that the custody is equated with the ability to move assets. And as I'll talk about in more detail in a minute, the federated model can be set up in such a way that only the user has the ability to move assets. And from that point of view, the user has custody rather than the servers that are holding the key shares.
We have a question.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah. I don't see where you, hi.
Yeah. So the case where it's federated and the user kind of has the ability to move shares, the problem kind of reduces to how do they authenticate themselves to this server group, right? So how do we
Yes.
think about that? Because the security.
Yeah,
kind
I'm
of-
going to talk about exactly this. I mean, the short answer is that we're going to have them authenticate using, using WebAuthn, for example. And then ultimately what that means is that there's going to be a signature required from the user in order to move assets.
Okay. Thank you.
But I'm going to talk more in detail about that in a few slides. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, what I want to talk about actually is some advantages of this federated model. And I want to kind of separate them into two categories. One is what I think of as, I didn't really have a better term for this, but think of it as quote unquote architectural advantages, kind of different advantages of this model versus the other model that I talked about where one of the key shares resides on the user's personal device. And that'll sort of be a non-technical portion of the talk. Maybe the first half of the talk or so will be relatively non-technical. And then the second half of the talk, I'm going to focus on more technical considerations as what I see as cryptographic technical advantages of the federated model, and some discussion of how we've taken advantage of that in the protocols that we're building at Defense. So as far as the architectural advantages go, I want to talk about sort of three classes of architectural advantages of the federated model, one of which is usability, the second of which is security, and the third is availability, or you can think of it also as a sort of efficiency gain as well. So as far as the usability goes, this is in relation to the question I was asked a minute ago. From the point of view of the user, their experience of interacting with the API in order to generate a signature is unchanged from the experience that they're used to when interacting with their bank account or when interacting with other Web 2 technologies. So as I was saying a minute ago, we can have users authenticate using WebAuthn passwordless technology, which could incorporate a PIN or perhaps biometrics or another hardware device like a YubiKey, which is, again, is something that the user is already familiar with, the user is already using for their other interactions with financial companies. And so from their point of view, they don't have to adapt to kind of this model where they have to manage private keys or think about key shares or think about printing things out on pieces of paper, et cetera. So from that point of view, we think it's a real benefit to not require the user to have to migrate to some different mechanism for authentication in order to generate a signature. And as I said a minute ago, ultimately, a signature from the user is going to authorize execution of the signing protocol. So really, the picture is now something like this. You have the three servers in this federated key management network that are holding the key shares. You have the user's device. The user's device will have some means of authentication, as part of which the user will generate a signature on their request to then generate a signature using the private key that's shared among those three backend servers. So the three backend servers will then verify this signature on the request from the user. That can now be any signature scheme. It doesn't have to be thresholdized, doesn't have to be discrete log-based. It could be whatever you like. And then only in response to seeing a verified signature request will the servers go ahead and execute the protocol. And of course, we can maintain freshness using a challenge response mechanism here to prevent replay attacks. So as I said, the user experience is unchanged. They authenticate and authorize transactions using techniques that they're already comfortable with. Is there a question? Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. So you said that only the user can trigger a signature, and that you enforce that using TEs, right? So that the shares are saved in the TEs. So you would need to do the signature verification inside the TEs, right?
I didn't hear part of it. We need to do the signature verification?
Yeah, the signature verification of the user, you need to do that inside of the TEs and directly tie that into the signature, the distributed signature algorithm, right?
Yeah, if you're doing what I said earlier and having, let's see. Yeah, so if you're doing what I said earlier and you have those three backend servers running the MPC protocol inside of an enclave, then the signature verification would have to be done inside the enclave as well.
Yeah, but the problem is that how do you tie the public key that corresponds to the key share that is distributed across the shares to the identity of the user, right? first of all, usually you would have multiple identities, or you'd need to change identities from time to time. What happens if the user loses its identity? Does it lose the access? But if it doesn't, then there has to be some kind of mechanism that would allow you to override that check, right, in order to replace the identity, right? So how could you not use that same mechanism to actually bypass the security?
Yeah, I think I understand your question. It actually had kind of multiple parts. I think in terms of the first part about binding the verification to a particular key share, that's going to be done actually at key generation time, right? The same identity you're going to use to make later signing requests is going to be the identity you use when you generate the key, so the binding can be done at that point in time. The question about recovery is a good question, actually. I'm trying to think a minute. I mean, I talk about recovery later, but I'm thinking about it now specifically in terms of the enclave. I think I have to think about it, actually. We can discuss it offline. I need to think about a little bit about it. I mean, I will talk about recovery a little bit, but you are correct that there is some sort of, when you're running inside of an enclave, there is kind of a moment when you do have to do this rebinding, as it were. That's going to be done by some dedicated mechanism, but yeah, we can talk about it offline.
Yeah. It's just that usually it's the hardest thing to solve, right?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's hard whether you're using enclaves or not, and it's hard actually in any of these models. So I agree that it's a challenge.
Okay.
So let's see. Yeah, and the other point I was going to make is that the users are maintaining a single authentication token on their phone, rather than having to maintain one key share per wallet, essentially. And this is also advantageous from the point of view of recovery, again, not thinking specifically in terms of enclaves, but in terms of having to refresh their authentication token. This is something that they would be able to do. It's sort of much easier, and again, using kind of techniques that they're already familiar with from the Web 2 world, rather than having to refresh a key share, which might either be difficult or impossible depending on the exact setup, on the number of, on the size of the threshold, etc.
So, sorry, I wanted to rebound on the prior slide, because I don't think the problem is only related to recovery. It's also, it can extend to actually signature. And the case is the following: if the user signature is dependent on a method that it already knows, so you highlighted, for example, the device biometrics or the PIN, right? Or even passkeys, for that matter. The problem is that that also can be bypassed, right? And so
maybe it depends. I mean, PIN is probably a bad example because that can be guessed.
But passkeys also, because they fall back on PIN, and Face ID and Touch ID fall back on PIN. So, for example, if your PIN is guessed or known or shared, or your device stolen and brute forced, so that also can be bypassed. So the question is there a way to think about enforcing signatures that ties the signature to the identity of the user, that corners those cases, right? And I think it's kind of related to the same question that was asked before, but it's not just for recovery. I think it extends to signature.
Yeah, I think, so first of all, I would push back a little bit when you say that biometrics can be bypassed. I mean, it depends a lot on what kind of biometrics you're talking about and what kind of mechanism is being used. But what I want to say is that one thing to keep in mind is that this problem in particular applies to either solution, right? Whether you store a key share on the user's phone, or whether you store some other authentication mechanism on the phone. If an attacker gets access to the phone and can bypass the protection mechanisms on the phone, then neither solution is going to be resilient. What I will say, though, and I have this on a following slide, is that one advantage, I think, of this sort of a model that I'm talking about here is that if an attacker is able to compromise a user's phone, in the federated model, what they get is a credential to unlock the key rather than the key itself. Whereas in the former model, they get a key share which they can then use to authenticate. And this is important, actually, right? Because if you have a user, let me try to say, there's a lot of keys floating around. It's hard to keep disambiguate them. But if you have for example, if you have a policy mechanism set up on the back end to restrict the kind of transactions that can be executed, then even if an attacker gets access to the user's phone and bypasses their biometrics, they will not be able to, by that alone, circumvent the policy rules on the back end. Whereas if the attacker is able to reconstruct the entire private key, then they bypass the entire mechanism, and then they can do whatever they like with the funds. So I think that's a distinction to keep in mind as well. Good. Yeah, I like this interactive mechanism. It's good. I think also from the point of view of security, this federated model has advantages. And again, from our point of view, from the point of view of the company, we see it as advantageous to have a security-focused company or a set of companies being responsible for securing key shares rather than putting the burden on the user. And if you look historically, the user's lack of proper management or lack of proper security controls on their devices has been historically the #1 cause of key loss in the cryptocurrency space. And we believe it's actually the right trade-off to make for the average user to push that onus onto a company whose entire business model is centered around providing security for the keys that they're managing. It also allows for putting the key shares in different jurisdictions, perhaps for various policy or legal requirements to remain compatible with those. And I should mention this, I think there's a talk tomorrow about this as well, that it even allows you to do things that provide very strong protection for the key shares. For example, putting all the key shares in space and having the backend servers that I drew in the previous slide being run on satellites. Right? And this would allow those keys to be much more harder for an attacker to access rather than in the other model where you have a key share being stored on the user's phone, which is relatively easy to steal. And again, just from the point of view of the security perimeter here, we think that it's much more reasonable for the back-end servers being operated by a company to be secured and to be locked down, much more so than the user's individual device. Related to the question I was asked earlier, in the federated model, compromise of a user's device does not leak a key share. The user's WebAuthn credential, right, you might be worried about the fact that it's kind of a chicken and an egg problem, because if you compromise the user's phone, well, you get access to their WebAuthn credential. But there's a little bit of a distinction here that I think is important, which is that the user's WebAuthn credential can be stored in an enclave on their device, which itself is protected by two-factor authentication, again, like biometric authentication. And this is in contrast to the typical case where you would have a key share on the user's phone that's resident in main memory, at least during execution of the protocol itself, which gives the attacker who steals the user's phone the ability to actually grab that key share itself rather than having it locked away inside of an enclave on the user's phone. So again, this is another example of where we can rely on strong hardware protection to give additional security in this federated model. Is there another question? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So again here, if you're compromising the user device...
Sorry, where's the question? Oh, yeah, okay, good.
So if you compromise the user device, if the user is able to sign and you are not enforcing anything except for authorization, for authentication, then you can sign a transaction that steals the money, right? And
so yeah, so I'll make
two
two points, right? So the first point again is that if you're, I mean, it depends on your assumptions, but if you think about the credential as being stored inside of an enclave that needs biometric authentication in order to use, then if the attacker steals the phone but cannot bypass the biometric authentication, they still can't issue anything on behalf of the user.
It's not really true, because the user would, in some point of time, need to make a transaction, and if you are executing code on the device, you can wait until it issues a transaction. It will go through the authentication of the biometrics because he wants to sign the transaction that he wanted to sign, but then actually you're an attacker that execute the code and you switch the message to your message.
Yeah, so you're talking now about a scenario where you're running malware on the device and then you're interfering with the signing request as it's happening, right?
Yeah, you said it's compromised, so.
Yeah, so when I said compromise, I meant physically, like an attacker steals your phone in the middle of the night.
Okay.
But malware on the device that interferes with the signing request, again, that's a problem in any solution. Any solution, even self-custody, right? That's a problem.
Yeah, it is the problem. That's why if you distribute the secret between multiple devices, but you require additional authorization either through policy or because it's different human beings that are doing the authorization, then you can help mitigate it. But yes, it's a
Yeah,
problem.
so the policy we can have. I've never seen in the real world a scenario. I mean, I know you can think about it, but I don't think it's practical. Well, I shouldn't say that. I mean, in most of the solutions nowadays, people don't have three different human beings independently entering the request and validating it. You could imagine it, but it's unusual, I think, to have that. It would be very complicated. Yeah, I mean, this is, well, anyway, it would be kind of complicated to implement that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello there. Here
Oh,
again.
yes.
When you say
You guys should sit near each other. No way.
Maybe, but you get good content, so you get good questions.
Yeah.
When you say biometric authentication here in the first bullet, are you referring to the device biometric?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a problem because, and that's what I was referring before, is that, and that's the case that you mentioned, if the phone gets physically stolen, this can happen actually quite frequently, or even SIM swapped. Okay, which has happened to Vitalik yesterday. If it happened to Vitalik, it can happen to anyone. The problem of device biometrics is that it falls back on a PIN code. And so
you mean in case of recovery?
In any case, any device biometrics, Face ID, Touch ID, after a number of failure, will systematically fall back on a PIN code. So it's as resilient or as secure as a PIN code. So if the PIN code is known, guessed, brute force, shared, taken over, whatever, then the security is as strong as the PIN code. And the fact that biometric...
But this is not exactly true, right? I mean, like Apple products, for example, if you enter the wrong PIN code, they have an exponential backoff on the timing, and eventually you'll be locked out of your own device. You need some other recovery mechanism.
That is correct, after a number of failed trials. What I'm saying is that the biometric layer itself is as strong as a PIN code. Not stronger, not weaker, it's the same. And so you're not protected by a recovery, you're just protected by a PIN code, which I think by default is 4 digits or 6 digits, something like that. Yeah. So I just wanted to precise that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, so I don't think that it necessarily has to be that way, right? You could have other recovery mechanisms that don't rely on a PIN code. In practice, that may be the way that it's currently implemented now. Although, again, well, anyway, I don't. There's a difference, right, between being able to brute force a PIN, which you can do given enough time, and guessing a PIN, which yes, you can do, but it's again going to be 1 in 10,000 chance or something like that. So I think I would make a distinction between those. And let me think what else I was going to say.
We can also take a few of these discussions offline. It's a good point to
sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, but I appreciate the question, so it's fine. Good. So right. So the other point is that the WebAuthn credential is independent of the private key that's being used to move funds, and so again, losing it does not imply loss of funds. I think I covered this point already in response to a prior question. So this is just basically, indicating the fact that we imagine the secret key, the user's signing key, or the WebAuthn credential, and more generally, is being locked inside of a hardware enclave that the user would need to access in order to sign the request that's being forwarded to the signers on the back end. So as I was saying again in response to some of the questions earlier, the company that's managing, or the companies that are managing these servers, are not only going to be focused much more so on security than the user would be able to, but the company can implement additional security controls to prevent unauthorized access to the key. Things like monitoring, things like anomaly detection, logging for after-the-fact detection when something goes wrong, things like that, which are infeasible for a user to do on their own, but which the company can do on behalf of the user. And I guess I would put there also this comment about policy, that again, if you have a policy in place on the back end to prevent any signatures being issued for larger than a certain amount, then even if the attacker is able to gain access and bypass the biometrics and gain access to the user's WebAuthn credential, they still cannot issue arbitrary transactions, but only transactions as limited by the policy that's being enforced. The company can also undergo audits and certification, something, again, that's going to be infeasible for a user to do for their private device, even if they wanted to. And the company is also going to be better able to handle response and recovery than an individual user. They would have in place, for example, a disaster recovery plan. They would have insurance in case funds were lost, things that a user will not be able to do on their own. Turning to recovery, I think one thing also to think about is what happens, again, exactly in this case of the PIN, for example, if the user resets the WebAuthn credential, for example, then this is going to give the user a fresh WebAuthn credential, not their private key. So again, if the user is able to bypass whatever mechanisms are in place, then in the best case, this means that they can issue signature requests, but they can't do arbitrary things with those requests. Again, it's going to be limited by the policy that's in place because the attacker only gets access to a credential rather than the private key itself. And you can use other controls, for example, a lockout period in case, for example, the user performs recovery, or let me say differently, in case the company observes the user performing recovery and then resetting their WebAuthn credential, you can then enforce a lockout period before additional transactions can be done, and you can contact the user out of band and confirm that they actually did reset their credential. Something that, again, is impossible if the attacker can get hold of the actual private key itself that's controlling the funds on the chain. And the assigned requests from the user also provide an audit trail for all actions that are being done in the system. So this is very important from the point of view of after-the-fact accountability, that any transaction that's performed by the system is backed up by a set of signatures on the back end that can be maintained by the company and used as proof, at least of the fact that that those servers did indeed receive a signed transaction from the user, authorizing them to issue that transaction. I think also from the point of view of availability, the federated model has some advantages. As far as I understand it, and someone can correct me here if I'm wrong, but the non-federated type of solution where the user's phone or personal device is storing one of the key shares seems to inherently assume an n out of n scheme, right? Because if the threshold were less than n, then the user's device wouldn't be necessary to issue a signature, and then there would be sort of no point to storing it on the user's phone. And what that means is that you can have a potential loss of availability if one of the servers is down or otherwise unreachable. Whereas in the federated model, you can have arbitrary thresholds t out of n depending on what, depending on your risk profile. But at the very minimum, you have the possibility of using a threshold lower than n, which can allow for greater availability. And from a technical point of view, and this is something I'll touch on again later, this means that a non-federated solution does not seem compatible with an honest majority protocol. What are the advantages of an honest majority protocol is that they can be actually much more efficient than the dishonest majority protocols that have been the focus of a lot of the research because it makes for challenging research problems. But in practice, you prefer a more efficient protocol, which you can do in the honest majority setting. Was there another question?
Yeah, so on the non-federated solution, you refer to the model where you have two servers and one mobile device.
It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be two, but I just mean where there's one share on the phone.
Yeah, so you can have actually a transformation where, for example, the T out of N can have the client have more than, so basically you just make sure that the majority or the threshold of the servers cannot actually sign, but it requires a large portion of shares from the
So you mean something like a more general access structure where you
right.
require 1 plus T? You can. I have not seen that in practice. I mean, I know you can theoretically design such protocols. Are you aware of that in practice being done?
No.
Are you aware? You're doing something like that? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, as I said in my lecture, we already have done that, so that you can have a user with a T out of N, and you need both.
Just a more general access structure.
Yeah. It's possible, but you're right. It's not trivial, but it's possible.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll change it. It's not trivial. Yeah. Good. Okay. So I want to move on in the second part of the talk, and I think I'm a little bit limited on time, perhaps, because I'm trying to get back on schedule. But I want to talk a little bit about some technical advantages that I see from the federated solution. And I think this is more interesting perhaps to the cryptographers in the room who like maybe new research challenges to think about. And I'll mention one in particular that I think is a really nice question. So I've been talking about this federated key management network, and at least the picture that I presented so far is one where you have some number of servers. In this picture it's 3, and they're each storing key shares that collectively determine some private key. But in fact, in this kind of a federated key management network, what you'd really have is you'd have each server holding n key shares, because collectively the network is managing n keys, where n is actually going to be quite large. It's going to be on the order of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. And this, again, is something which is a little bit different from what you have in the non-federated case, where, again, you could have the same, let's say in the picture I showed with 2 servers and 1 phone, you could have those 2 servers doing the key sharing and sharing n keys between them, but then they would actually be, in general, be sharing the third share with n different user devices. So it means that some of the kind of techniques I'm going to talk about here are not fully applicable to that kind of a setting, simply because you don't have each party storing n different shares. You have, in that case, n different parties playing the role of the user's device, which is different from the model here. So what does this give you? Well, it gives you a couple of things, actually. First of all, it allows you to utilize very aggressive preprocessing. I know some of the talks this morning talked about the ability to do preprocessing for some signing protocols. But again, I think this can only be done to a more limited extent in the non-federated model. And in the federated key management network, you can actually do this aggressively, and you can do this across all devices. You can have all of them participate in the pre-signing and push this to the maximum extent possible to make the online signing itself much more efficient. And I'll show some examples of where you can do this both for signing and for key generation. And I guess related, but maybe a little bit more generally, is you can take advantage of shared state between these different parties that are all running the signing protocol for different keys. For example, you can talk about batch signing across multiple keys and exploiting preprocessing for multiple keys rather than, again, just for a single key at a time. So I'll give kind of 3 examples here, and I think, well, we'll see. I mean, yeah, what time should I realistically end by? 5 minutes from now? No. How about 10 minutes from now?
That's good. Yeah, so 10 minutes
Okay.
from now is good.
Okay. No, that's what I was told beforehand. So I won't go into many technical details. I'll just sort of highlight the main points here. But I'll give 3 examples, or I'll try to get through 3 examples, one of which is related to provisioning in the CGG-MP protocol, another which is related to pre-signing, and then a third which is a robust key generation. And I think if I don't have time, I'll skip the third one. It'll be OK. But I want to make sure to cover at least the first 2. So I won't, this is just a review of ECDSA. People who were here before lunch already saw this, so I won't belabor it. Just a very high-level overview of the CGG-MP protocol. It's a dishonest majority protocol for ECDSA. It can tolerate any threshold that you set up. It's universally composable. It supports pre-signatures, by which I mean that you can run the majority of the protocol offline before the message to be known is going to be signed. And then when the servers obtain the message to be signed, they can actually run a non-interactive online phase to generate that signature. And that's a very nice feature that a lot of the more modern protocols have. And the protocol at a high level, I think actually the talk right before lunch did a good job of setting this up. But the way that key generation and provisioning is done in the CGG-MP protocol is, first of all, to run a distributed key generation protocol to share the private key. And the details are not important for what I'm going to speak about here. But then they, and I'll denote this by using the same notation as earlier, this bracket notation to indicate some kind of a secret sharing of the secret. And in addition, the CGG-MP protocol has the servers generate, each of them, PIA encryption keys, and then share those keys with each other. And in addition, there are these values S and T that each server is supposed to set up, share with the other servers, and give certain zero-knowledge proofs of correctness about those values. And these PIA keys are actually used both for homomorphic operations, as was touched on in the earlier talk, but it's also used for, to commit to certain values, which is used inside the security proof to allow the simulator essentially to extract those values during the execution of the protocol. And then the signing itself basically runs something like the following, again at a very high level. The parties are going to collectively generate shares of a random value K inverse and a random value A. They're going to use some multiplication protocol, which is done using the PIA encryption, but I'm not going to give the details, to compute shares of the product, A times K inverse, and K inverse times X. The parties can then compute G to the A They can also reveal the value AK inverse. So this is basically a blinding of the value K inverse that needs to remain secret. They can use those to then compute G to the K. I'm using multiplicative notation rather than the additive notation from earlier. And then compute this public function f on that value to obtain a value r. And then they can locally compute m times k inverse plus r times k inverse x, right? Because they already have sharings of k inverse and k inverse x. And that's basically a sharing of a proper ECDSA signature. And then they can reconstruct that value to obtain the signature itself. And some observations we had, actually, this is based on our experience in implementing the CGGMP protocol over the past several months. First of all, is that provisioning turns out to be rather slow because of the need to generate these PAE keys and also because of the zero-knowledge proofs that are required. And so one observation is that in this federated model, you can actually do provisioning on a per cluster basis, or a per network basis if you like, rather than per private key. So the way the paper describes the protocol, you have this provisioning done on a per key basis, but it's actually wasteful to do that, and you can do it instead on a per cluster basis and then share as many keys as you like. And I'll point out actually that some prior protocols, like the GG18 protocol, did not have this property because they actually required key-specific PAE encryption keys, but the CGGMP protocol does not. You need to, of course, check that this doesn't ruin the security proof, but you can go ahead and we did this and verify that, in fact, it's fine to go ahead and do that. Furthermore, the signing protocol is relatively slow. What we found, right, so there's, well, let me just say in particular, one thing that comes up during the course of executing the signing protocol is that there are roughly 20 times t, where t again is the threshold parameter, 20 times t computations of the form si to the x, ti to the y. This is essentially a multi-exponentiation mod some PAE value, PAE modulus ni. And these are not short exponents either. You have x on the order of 500, y on the order of 3500, and the modulus itself on the order of 3000 bits at the 128-bit security level. And one thing we observed actually is that during provisioning, in addition to setting up these PAE keys and setting up the required values and giving the zero-knowledge proofs of correctness, you can also at that time do pre-computation to speed up the later multi-exponentiations that are going to all be done using the same fixed Si, Ti, and Ni that are going to be fixed throughout the lifetime of that cluster. And this can actually give quite a significant speed up for something like the parameters I gave above. You can easily get an 8x speed up just by storing 190 kilobytes of material that you generate during the pre-processing phase, and you can trade off more generally the amount of storage that you use and the speed up that you get during the course of the protocol. So I'm going to skip the technical details of that. Good. Let me talk briefly about pre-signing. So as I noted earlier, pre-signing is this ability to do a lot of the work before the message to be signed is known. And if you look at the protocol structure that I laid out here, you'll see actually that the first 3 of the steps here are all independent of the message, and so can be done, as I said, before the message is known. When the message comes, only the final step has to be run, which is entirely local computation, followed by just a broadcast of the value that's computed by each server. And so this is just a picture of it, right? So you can think about, actually, let me go back and show it. So whoops. Anyway, you see I'm not used to using this device, or rather this Google Slides. So yeah, the parties can run some offline interactive protocol beforehand to generate what I'll call as pre-signatures. Then when the user issues a signing request, they can use those pre-signatures to do, again, local computation, send the result to the user to reconstruct and form a signature. Now in practice, right, what you'd like to do is be able to run this pre-signing phase not just once, but a whole lot of times, right? So you want to be able to generate n different pre-signatures that you can then use to satisfy online signing requests. And again, think about this in the context of servers that are managing private key shares on behalf of many, many, many different private keys. And what you realize is that what you actually would like is what I'll call key-independent pre-signing, which means you'd like for the servers to be able to run some pre-signing step, which will give them these pre-signatures that are not tied to any particular key. so that then when a signing request comes in for any of the keys that these servers hold, they'll be able to satisfy that request using one of the pre-signatures that they've generated. Okay? Now, of course, if you have key-dependent pre-signing, you can still do that, but you end up having a lot of pre-signature material that's sitting around not being used. Right? You'd have to end up, for example, generating one pre-signature for every key that you store, even though many of those keys may not be used very frequently. And that's sort of rather wasteful. Now, I will point out that it's difficult to have key-independent pre-signatures in a CGGMP-style protocol. And this is basically related to the fact that you need, somewhere along the line, K inverse X for signing, at least for the CGGMP protocol, which is tying together the preprocessed value of K with a particular key share or a particular private key, X. And if you try to do that during an online phase, the problem is that the multiplication, or at least CGGMP-style multiplication, in a dishonest majority setting, seems to inherently require interaction. And actually, I'm not aware of any solution to this issue. So I'm not aware of any solution for dishonest majority ECDSA that has key-independent pre-signing. And the protocol that was presented this morning, as far as I could tell, does not have it either. And I didn't see, in the 5 minutes I thought about it, how to adapt it. And as far as I know, it may not even be possible. So I leave that as an interesting kind of a question.
We have a question here. So if I understand the problem correctly, it's that you want the the benefit of one round signing without. I see. So if you create some. If you think of this as...
I mean, I can give you the problem cleanly if you want it. Right? The basic problem is, so let's say I allow you arbitrary pre-processing. I don't care how long it takes. And I want you to set up some information such that then for any key that you share, you can generate a signature in one round.
OK. So the protocol that I presented, if you have this ECDSA tuple thing of this correlated randomness thing, you can sign in one round. And you can, if you assume that correlation falls out of the sky, you can de-randomize it on the fly, right? So
I didn't see how, because you have the blinding factor that's correlated between K and the key.
I mean, you can, I think, just publish the offset and fix it. OK.
So maybe if you can do it, I'd be very interested. So maybe we can talk about it offline. But it seemed like you had some correlation there in the tuple, so it's tied, as far as I saw, tied to a particular key. So the only thing I'll point out, and maybe I'll kind of end here after this slide, is that you can achieve key-independent ECDSA pre-signatures using an honest majority protocol. And basically, I had a slide about it, but I won't get to present it. This is because if you have T sharings of two different values, where T is less than half of n, then you can actually do one-round multiplication with an additional check. Basically because the degree of the polynomial is still less than the number n, and you can reconstruct afterward. So it seems to be something that's hard to do in the dishonest majority case, but relatively easy to do in the honest majority case. And I'll just, this is kind of not relevant since I'm going to skip the slides after this, but I will point out that there's been some prior work on honest majority ECDSA. In particular, there's a nice paper by Damgaard et al. From 2020. But that solution appears to be patented, and so I'm not sure the status of that patent, but it needs some thought to address how to construct a non-patented solution to this problem. Okay, which we've done, but I'll skip it in the interest of time. Good. So yeah, I thought I had 20 more minutes, but so there's lots more interesting stuff here. Let me just jump to the conclusions. Yeah, good. So what I've talked about today is two models for threshold signatures, this federated model and the non-federated model. I've talked about some of the architectural advantages of the federated model, usability, security, and availability, and then talked about some technical advantages of the federated model. I didn't get time to talk about these in full detail. I'm happy to share these slides with anyone if they're interested, or talk offline as well. One related to CGGMP provisioning and preprocessing, one related to key-independent, and I didn't get to talk about it at all, about batching of pre-signatures. And then I didn't get to talk about using preprocessing for efficient and robust DKG as well. But actually, I'll talk about this at the NIST workshop that's coming up, I guess, in 2 weeks, I think it is. I'm going to talk about this there. And I think it's a good question to think about how else we can take advantage of the federated model, especially for people who enjoy designing new cryptographic protocols. I think there's a lot more room for improvement here. And with that, I'll thank you, and I'll be happy to take any more questions that you might have.
Thank you for the nice presentation. I have a question. In the federated model, have you thought of applications where it may be of interest to protect the privacy of the client's request? So, for example, you would have the client want to ask for a signature where the federation would not learn what is being signed.
Yeah, it's a really good question. We haven't thought about that, and in fact, we're thinking a little bit the opposite, because we want to be able to enforce policies on what's being signed. And if you're enforcing policies, the most natural, well, in some sense, the only way to do that is to reveal what's being signed to the network. I mean, you could also distribute the policy checking, but it's actually more robust to have each signer individually verify the policy rather than collectively verify.